But the real reason I don't need any pieces of paper or notes to share with you what I'd like to share with you is because it is forever embedded in my head and in my heart. I hope to never need any prompting or memory teasers to remember it. And it is particularly appropriate, I hope, here because of what you're doing and because of the teacher-student relationship, because of the mentor and mentee relationship that goes on. And I want to just share a story about a relationship like that I had that really has brought me here to you. It centers around a teacher of mine when I was back in college, whose name was Maury Schwartz. He was the Maury of Tuesdays with Maury. Maury stood about yay high. He had silver hair and green eyes and a crooked tooth smile and a really wonderful way of making you feel like you were the first student he'd ever taught. I can still remember the first day that I met him because it was the first day of classes in 1975 at Brandeis University. He taught sociology. I had signed up for Intro to Sociology. I entered the room where his class was, and there were 9 kids in the class. And being a typical freshman, I immediately said, no. This is much too small a class. If I cut it, they'll know I'm not here. I wanted a class about this size right here. So I actually was leaving to go drop the course at the registrar's office when he began to call roll. And one of the problems when your last name begins with A. And so I heard him say Mitch Albom, and so I was kind of half out, half in, and I kind of slid back in out of guilt, and I raised my hand and I said, here. And he said, is it Mitch or Mitchell? Which do you prefer? Now, I'm sure to you that doesn't mean a lot, but to me I was actually touched that he asked me that because I have one of those names that depending on what the teacher wants to go with in any particular year, you're Mitchie or Mitchell or Mitch or whatever. So I said to him, well, Mitch, my friends call me Mitch. And he said, all right, Mitch it is. And Mitch? And I said, yeah. He said, I hope one day you'll think of me as your friend. So I knew cutting the class was out of the question at that point. But that began this really amazing relationship that I ended up having with Maury. I took that class and another class with him and another class. I ended up taking every class that he offered. I ended up majoring in sociology, not because I was all that interested in it, to be honest with you, but it would have been a shame to waste all those credits. You know, I really majored in Maury, but they didn't give out degrees in that at the time. You know. But it was the kind of relationship that I hope all of you students who stood up before can find in your educational lives, because it was more than just the classroom. We walked around campus together, we sat under trees, we ate together sometimes. In fact, it delighted me to find out that Maury in his own way was as much of a slob when it came to eating as I was. Not because he lacked manners, but because he was always full of these big ideas. You know, he always had to talk about these big topics. He would, you know, life and the meaning of it, and he would warn me, you know, don't be like the pre-med students, they're always worrying about their grades all the time. Don't be like the pre-law students worrying about how much money they're gonna make. You know, follow your heart, follow your dreams, be involved with your community, you know, get involved, all these big, huge, wonderful things, but sometimes he would forget to chew. And I used to sit across from him. I can remember as I'm sitting here because it's lunchtime. He used to eat these egg salad sandwiches. And you'd be sitting there and these little yellow projectiles would come flying out of his mouth and you'd be like a hockey goalie, you know. But it was just another endearing quality of this man who really, by graduation day, had kind of become more of like an uncle to me than a teacher. And on graduation day, I got him a gift. I had never gotten a gift for a teacher ever before, and I had no money to my name, so it must have been the cheapest gift ever, but I got him a briefcase. And they etched his initials in, you know, with a little rub thing onto the front. And I gave it to him. And you would have thought I was giving him a brick of gold. I mean, he turned it around every which way, and he began to cry, and took me around, gave me a big hug, and he said, Mitch, you're one of the good ones. Promise me you'll stay in touch. I said, okay, I will. Promise. Okay, I promise. Say it in a sentence. Okay, Maury, I promise I'll stay in touch. I promise I'll stay in touch. And then I graduated. and I went off into the world to do all those nice things that you heard in the governor's introduction. And I proceeded to break that promise every day, every week, every month, and every year for 16 years. 16 years without even a phone call. Now, I can hear what you're all too polite to say. How could you do that? You just got done telling us how close you were with them. Well, as some of you students will discover, it's not as if we intend to lose touch with our teachers. Oh, you get out of school, you say, next summer I'm going to drive back up and visit, and then the next year, well, this summer I'll drive up and visit. And a couple more years, you say, well, I'll call first, and then maybe I'll drive up. A couple more years, I'll write a letter, and then maybe I'll call, maybe I'll go up. And meanwhile, if you're like me, or like a lot of you, I'm sure, your career is taking you places, right? So that's what happens in America. Our careers become the airplanes that we get on and take us all these places. And in my case, it took me some pretty good places, and it happened pretty quickly. When I got into journalism, all of a sudden I started traveling around. I'm seeing some great sporting events. Next thing you know, you're on television, and somebody recognizes you, you get an award, somebody asks for your autograph, you're hanging around with Michael Jordan, you get a bigger house, another award, a bigger paycheck, another award, another. And next thing you know, you wake up and you go, this was meant to be. I was hatched out of the egg with all this success coming my way. We forget the people who make us the kind of people who can have that kind of success. We forget our teachers. And I forgot mine for 16 years. Now, during that time, Maury continued to do what he had always done. He taught small groups of kids on campus. He didn't aspire to go to Harvard and show how smart he was. He didn't want to become the dean. He was happy just teaching a handful of students and reaching them every year. And when he wasn't teaching, he did what he had told me to do. He was involved with his community. He started clinics in the Boston area for people who couldn't afford to have psychiatric care, because somehow we think it's just rich people who have problems. Poor people don't have to talk about them. And when he wasn't doing that, he wouldn't sit in front of the television set or anything. He wasn't a couch potato. He was a guy who just loved life. He used to go on Wednesday nights. They used to have this thing at a church in Harvard Square called Dance Free, where you would go in and you would pay $5 to get in. I never understood that because it was called Dance Free, but you would go in and you could dance any which way you wanted, with anybody you wanted, however you wanted. He would go in with a towel around his neck and he would dance the tango and the merengue or the rumba. They were playing rock and roll music at the time, but it didn't bother him. He would grab anybody and dance around and spin around. They had no idea that he was this learned professor. They just thought he was this kooky old guy with white hair, and that's how Maury was. He just saw all these opportunities to wring joy out of life, like a wet rag every day. You could just get more drops out of it, and the next day you get up and you get another rag and you do it all over again. And he sort of went through his life like this, quite content, through his 50s, through his 60s, and into his 70s. And in his 70s, he began to notice a change in his body. Long walks would leave him tired. He'd say, I'm getting old. Going up steps, he'd have to stop and rest. Then he began to stumble inexplicably. He'd get out of the car and he'd just trip, fall down. And then one night he went to a wedding with his wife, and they were out on the dance floor, and he fell over onto the dance floor. And as he would later say to me, Mitch, I never fell when I danced. So we began that process that we have in this country of trying to find out, what's the matter with me. One doctor and another doctor and another doctor and an MRI and a CAT scan and blood work and another doctor and another MRI and another test and another. 8 months. 8 months of trying to discover why his body was betraying him. Until finally, on a beautiful summer day in Boston, he sat across from a neurologist in his office, and the neurologist said to him, Maury, I have some bad news. You have ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease. And Maury thought back to his youth. He'd grown up in New York. He remembered Lou Gehrig. He said, Lou Gehrig's disease, that's fatal. The doctor said, yeah, it is. Maury said, well, it used to be fatal, right? I mean, they have a cure for it now, right? No. The doctor said, there's no cure. Well, how long do I have left to live? Maury asked. Hard to say, the doctor said. Maybe a couple years. Well, Maury walked out of that doctor's office to the same beautiful summer day that he had left behind just a few hours earlier. And he took in the view. He saw the blue skies. He saw people riding bicycles and laughing. Someone was playing Frisbee on the lawn. And a voice inside of him screamed out, "Hey! Hey! What's going on? Don't you all know what just happened to me in there? Isn't everybody supposed to come running up to me now and saying, 'We heard the news. We're so sorry. No more Frisbee. No more bicycles. No more blue skies. The whole world will turn gray because you got a death sentence.'" And he waited for that to happen. But it didn't happen. Because the world cannot cater to one individual. And so on the steps of that building, my old professor made a very profound decision. He could either go this way, be angry all the rest of his days. Why me? Why did I get stuck with this lousy lot? Or he could go this way and try to find something positive in this terribly negative hand that he had been dealt. And because he'd always been more positive than negative, and because he'd always been a teacher, he chose. And he decided he would teach about what it was like to die right up until the day he died. After all, he said, everybody's going to die. There must be something that I'll learn that I can pass on. And so even as ALS began its terrible march through Maury's body, and if any of you have had any exposure to this disease, then you know it is just the cruelest of diseases, because it snips the connection between your brain and the rest of your body. And so over time, you lose the use of your limbs and your fingers and your arms, and eventually everything just sort of decays and turns into a stiff husk of a body that needs to be carried from place to place, and yet your mind stays perfectly intact throughout the whole process. So you're fully aware of the horror that's happening to your body right up until the day you die. And in Maury's case, it began with his feet and worked its way up. And even as he went from walking to a cane, and a cane to a walker, and a walker to a wheelchair, and a wheelchair to needing to be carried from place to place, even as he lost the ability to pull up his own pants, buckle his own belt, brush his own teeth, even as he lost the ability to drive, to walk, to swim, even as he lost the ability to wipe his own rear end. So he needed to ask someone else to do it for him, like an infant. Everything that you have done today, up to this point, he did not do and could not do. And throughout all that, he taught. He taught. He invited people to come in, ask me questions. He said, I'm not embarrassed. What do you want to know? Pay no attention to this body. That's not me. That's the carton I was shipped in. It's not me. I'm still here. Look in my eyes. I'm still here. You want to do me a favor? Don't treat me like I already died. He learned things. He took in ideas. He wrote ideas down. And after a while, he had a pretty good list of these aphorisms of how to deal with a terminal illness. And a friend of his read this and was pretty impressed and sent it off unbeknownst to Maury to a reporter at the Boston Globe. And that reporter came out and did a story about the strange old man who was teaching a last class in what it was like to die. And that story found its way down to the desk of one Ted Koppel in Washington, D.C. And next thing you know, the Nightline program is coming up and doing an entire show on my old professor, Maury Schwartz. And that show aired on a Friday night. And it began with the words from Ted Koppel, "Who is Maury Schwartz, and why after tonight are so many of you going to care about him?" And 1,000 miles away, in my very comfortable home, in my very comfortable suburb, on my very large TV screen, I was doing the great American male tradition when I came upon the Nightline program. And I did a double take, because there on the screen was a thin, sickly, white-haired version of my old professor, who I had not seen in 16 years, and now was telling the world that in a few short months he was going to be dead. Well, what do you do when that happens? You're embarrassed, you're ashamed, you're saddened. My brilliant decision was to make a phone call. One phone call. That's all I was going to do. Ease my guilt, be done with it. His number was still listed. I dialed it and information. And back when I was in college, I used to call Maury Coach. It was a sports affectation, I guess, even then. Hi, Coach. How you doing, Coach? That kind of thing. Nurse answered the phone, handed it to him. He said hello. And I said, Professor Schwartz, my name is Mitch Albom. I was a student of yours in the 70s. I don't know if you remember me. And the first thing he said to me after 16 years, how come you didn't call me Coach? Needless to say, by the end of the conversation, I was coming to visit him. Guilt is a very powerful motivator. Still, my plan for a visit was a one-time visit. I would just get in and get out. In fact, at that point in my life, I was so wrapped up in my career, as I'm sure many of you have been, and I warn you students not to have happen to you, that I worked easily 120 hours a week for 5 or 6 different employers. I was one of those people who never said no because I was afraid if I say no, they won't ask me again. So I was doing full-time radio, full-time television, full-time newspapering, magazine writing, freelance writing, you name it, I did it. And when I landed in Boston, I rented a car and a cell phone, and I was talking on the cell phone to ESPN as I drove into Maury's neighborhood with plans to drop by for 30 minutes and then out. And I come down the street, and unbeknownst to me, Maury has asked his nurses to carry him outside in his wheelchair and put him on the curb so that he can greet me right when I get out of the car. And I come down the street and I see this figure in a wheelchair with 2 nurses next to it, and I kind of figure out what's going on, and I hit the brakes. Now, the proper thing to do, of course, is to take the cell phone, throw it out the window, and run out of the car and give a hug to this man who I hadn't seen in 16 years, right? And I'd like to say that that's what I did. But I didn't. What I did do was continue that conversation on the cell phone, but slowly drop down below the dashboard, pretending I was looking for something on the floor. And I stayed on the floor of that car, hiding, talking on the phone to ESPN about something I can't even remember now, because at that point in my life, work came first, and everything else could wait, even a dying old man. It's not a particularly pleasant story to tell about yourself. I share it because usually in a group this large, there's at least one other person in the room who knows if they were in that same situation, they'd be lying on the floor of that rent-a-car too. It was a mistake. Learn from my mistake. People before cell phones. Well, Maury, I don't think, knew what a cell phone was, and so when I got out of the car, he wanted to go in and eat. I, of course, was thinking egg salad, but turned out to be a much different experience because we sat at a table and I watched him try to pick up a piece of tomato and put it in his mouth, but his hand kept shaking so badly it fell off, and he tried to pick it up again, and it fell off again, pick it up again, finally get it into his mouth, and take him 2 minutes just to chew it and swallow a single piece of tomato. He was in a wheelchair. The house was a sick person's house, if you know what I mean. It had a certain smell. There was an oxygen machine in the corner. There were bottles of pills on the counter and boxes of soft food everywhere. And yet, Maury never complained, never talked about all these terrible things that were happening already. All he did was talk about the wonder of what he was discovering about life, even as it was winding down. How he likened himself to a tree when it dies. It's at its most colorful, right? All the leaves turn brilliant shades of yellow and red and orange just before it dies. I ended up staying all afternoon and into the evening. I took the last flight home. And on that flight home, I said to myself, you know, you're 37 years old and you're perfectly healthy. And he's 78 years old and dying. And yet he seems 10 times happier than you are. with his life. What's the matter with this picture? And I began to go back. Another Tuesday, the next Tuesday, the next Tuesday, and all the Tuesdays Maury had left in his life, to try to get the answer to that very simple question. What do we know when we're really looking death in the face that puts everything else into perspective? And wouldn't it be great to know that now, when we're young enough and healthy enough to do something about it? And I want to share a couple of those observations before I wrap up here. Because we broke it down every week, we kind of took a different subject and we talked about it a little bit. And Maury was able to say, this matters, this doesn't matter. You think this matters, but when you get to where I am, not going to matter. For example, money. There's not a person in this room to whom money is not an issue. It was funny when I was going to see Maury during that stretch, Ted Turner was in the news. You know Ted Turner, right? He used to own CNN and Jane Fonda, other investments. It's a joke. Well, maybe. He was in the news when I was flying out to see Maury. He was trying to buy CBS, and it was in all the newspapers. And he was leveraging stock. He was doing all these things to get his hands on CBS. And in this particular newspaper story that I was reading, a reporter said to him, Mr. Turner, you already have so much. Why is it so important that you buy CBS? And his answer in this story was, I don't want my tombstone to read, he never owned a network. So I brought that to Maury, who at the time was actually trying to decide what his tombstone should read. And I said, here, how about this? You never owned a network either. He passed on the idea, but it brought to mind something that's very important, very critical to what you're doing here. People would come to see Maury on those other Tuesdays, when I wasn't there, or other days of the week, and sometimes once in a while they'd come on a Tuesday, and they would always follow the same pattern. These were people who had maybe seen Maury on TV or vaguely knew him, and they were only coming once. And they were people who were very uncomfortable with death or sickness, and they all seemed to follow a pattern. They would stand outside the office, and they would psych themselves up to try to talk to a sick person, and they'd say, okay, happy stories, just going to tell happy stories, show them pictures of my kids, nothing down, nothing depressing. They'd be ready to go, and the door would open, and they'd go into the office, and the door would close. And they'd come out an hour later in tears. But they'd be crying about their divorce, their job, their life. And they'd say, well, I don't know what happened. I went and I tried to, sort of cheer him up, but after a couple minutes, he started asking me about my life, and then I started telling him, and he started asking more, and I started really telling him, and next thing I know, I was crying, and, I went in to try to cheer him up, but I ended up being cheered up by him. And I watched this happen, folks, so many times that finally I walked into Maury and said, I don't get it. I don't get it. If ever anyone had finally earned the right to say that sentence, let's not talk about your problems. Let's talk about my problems. It would be you. If ever anyone had really earned the right to say, you think you got it bad. Look at you, you can't move. You need somebody to carry you to the toilet. I have to turn your face just so that you can look at me. I have to wipe your eyes. I have to comb your hair. You've hit the mother lode of sympathy, Maury. Why don't you take advantage of it? And he looked at me as if I had just stepped off a spaceship. And he said, Mitch, why would I ever take from people like that? Taking just makes me feel more like I'm dying. Giving makes me feel like I'm living. Giving makes me feel like I'm living. It is a profound little sentence. It also rhymes, so it's easy to remember. Giving makes me feel like I'm living. And you know it's true, not just because you're students of giving, but you know that inside, innately, you know that the opposite is false. Taking never makes you feel alive. Oh, it works temporarily. It's the basis of capitalism and Madison Avenue and advertising. I mean, our whole consumer culture is basically based on the idea that, you know, you can feel more alive if you take something. You take this deodorant soap, put it under your arm. Well, I'm awake, alive. You know, take this refrigerator. Now my life is happy. Take this vacation. Wow, I'm good. But it doesn't last. We know that. We're all, when you take things, we're all like kids on Christmas morning. You ever see a 10-year-old on Christmas morning? You put a box in front of them. Wow, this is great. What else you got? You know, always on to the next thing, right? I'll prove it to you. Look back on the progression of cars in your life. All right, everybody here is of driving age, right? All right, just imagine for a moment. Think in your head. Go back to the first car that you ever modeled, the stuff you just wanted to start. So you can go to the mall or take your girlfriend out or whatever. You sit there with the king. You say, boy, if I could just get a car that doesn't break down every couple of months, I'd never want anything else. So you save your money, you get a used car that once. I just want to smell the smell and see the sticker on the window, and then I could never want anything else. So you have 4-door stuff, I could never want anything else. And then a few years later, the kids are grown, and you say, you know, I know it's crazy, I know it's nuts, but I have always wanted. Poor man want to be rich man want to be king. King isn't satisfied till he rules everything. That's not me, that's Bruce Springsteen. But it's a good line, right? That you've ever seen. With his dying breath, ever utter a sentence like, bring me the big screen television set. I just want to touch it one more time. No, you laugh because it's preposterous. But now think for real, no use to you. All that you have possessed and gathered will not help you one bit. It probably won't even be in the room with you. It'll be in the garage or the summer house or the bank vault. If in that final drop of sand through the hourglass, all that really matters is the people you love are there with you and you can look at them, hold their hands, look them in the eye, then what makes you think that in all the other drops of sand through the hourglass, that's not what's important too? What do they teach us in high school about grains of sand? You know, you can't tell one from the other, millions on the beach. The one that's dropping through your hourglass now, as you're listening to me talk, is the same as the one that's going to drop with your dying breath. And what will be important to you in that final drop of sand is what's important to you in the one that's dropping now. We just don't believe it because we all think we got endless sand. We're going to be the first generation that doesn't actually die. September 11th to me had one overriding lesson. It had nothing to do with geopolitics or global terrorism or anything like that. To me, if you ever listened to the tapes of those handful of people who managed to get phone calls out from those burning buildings or from those doomed planes, have you ever listened to them, gone and listened to, read the transcripts? Fascinating. Fascinating. Black or white, rich or poor, old or young, foreign or American, to a person, if they managed to get a phone call out, they called their loved ones and they virtually said the exact same thing. I called to tell you I love you. Not, honey, sell the stock. I called to tell you I love you. Not even, I called to hear you say you love me. In that final moment, when suddenly they realized that death was right in front of them, what made them feel alive was giving their love to somebody else. Giving is living. And any of you who have done, and many of you have, volunteer work, hospice work, gone to a shelter, anything like that, and at the end of the day you're cleaning up and someone calls your name out and you turn and they say, thank you. Thank you for helping. And you get that little like tingle in your stomach, like you did something right. That's being alive. And it shouldn't take our final days or a terminal illness to figure that out. And Maury and I talked about that on one particular Tuesday. One other thing. I went to see Maury And there was a bust. This was towards the end of our visits. There was a bust of him up on a shelf as a young man. And it's kind of strange to me. I don't really know anybody who's had a bust sculpted of them, except Beethoven. I didn't know him very well. And so I said to Maury, who did that? What is that? And he said, oh, well, my good friend Norman did that. And I said, Norman, I've been coming here for months. I never even heard you mention his name. He said, well, that's because there's a sad story with Norman. And he proceeded to tell me this story about this good friend, and they swam together and traveled together, ate lunch together, and I guess the guy was a bit of an amateur sculptor. And one summer, Maury went to his house every morning in the basement, and he worked on this bust, and at the end of the summer, he gave it to Maury as a gift of their friendship. Well, not long after that, Norman moved away to Chicago. And not long after that, Maury's wife took ill for a stretch of time. Nothing serious, but it was a little scary for a little while. And Norman apparently didn't call. And Maury was upset. He's a friend, he should call. And so when Norman finally did call, Maury was obstinate. Oh, now you call. Gee, Maury, I'm sorry, I should have called her. No, it's a little late for that. And every subsequent phone call, even as the months went on, still had the overtone of that argument. Gee, Maury, I still feel bad. No, well, forget it. No, forget it. It's over. It wasn't over. A crack had developed in the friendship. And because that crack was never really tended to, it spread, it grew, and it crumbled the relationship. And they lost touch with each other. Now, folks, I'm here to tell you that Maury did not need a reason to cry. I mean, when you have to have someone reach down your throat with a tissue and pull up the phlegm that you can't cough up lest you choke to death because you lack the ability to even do that anymore, you don't really need a reason to cry. I think you can pick any time of the day and just go. And yet, I never saw Maury cry in all the time I was with him as deeply or as passionately as when he finished this story about Norman. Tears that didn't come from the eyes, that came from in here, the solar plexus, like that. And he said, Mitch, I found out last year that Norman died from cancer. I never had the chance to make it up to him. Why did I let that foolish conversation separate us for all those years? It means nothing to me now. All I wish is that I could hold his hand or look him in the eye, just tell him he had been such a good friend all those years. But I can't, and I never will. And he looked me square on, and he said, Mitch, if there's anybody you love, anybody you care about, who you are fighting with or feuding with, let it go. Let it go. If you are 100% right and they are 100% wrong, you say you're wrong if it'll end it. Because when you get to where I am, and you will get to where I am, you won't care who was right or wrong. All you'll care about is that they're there and that they're part of your life. Forgive everyone, everything. And students, this is not something you should wait until you're old and gray to figure out. And those older than students, you know what I'm talking about. Forgive everyone, everything. It's just not worth it. The last thing I want to share with you happened the last day that I saw Maury, and it kind of encompasses what I'm trying to share with you here today. By this point, Maury was very weak. You couldn't really hear him. You had to kind of lean in very closely because his voice was down to a whisper. And Maury always wanted to be in his office. Even though he couldn't move, it was important to be carried from his bed and put in his office. Because he used to have an aphorism, if you're in bed, you're dead. And this particular Tuesday, I walked down the hallway to his office. I opened the door, and the chair was empty. And I thought for a minute, what happened? What happened? Was there an emergency? And then I walked back 3 steps to the bedroom door, and I opened that door, And there he was in bed. His frame was so small, it was like seeing a little boy's body underneath a blanket. And I sat down next to him, and I held his hand, which was imperative for Maury. And he said to me, I want to ask you a favor. I said, okay, anything. He said, after I die, I want you to come visit me at my grave. All right, I said, I was going to do that anyhow. Not the way everybody else does. Come, leave the car engine running, put down some flowers, jump back in the car. Not like that. Come when you have some time. Bring a blanket. Bring some sandwiches. Plan on sticking around. And I want you to talk to me about your life, about your problems. I said, wait a minute. You want me to come to a cemetery, have a picnic at your tombstone, and talk to the air? Exactly, he said. Just like we're talking now. I said, well, Maury, let's face it, it's not going to be like we're talking now because you won't be able to talk back. And he looked at me as if I were being very naive. And he said, well, Mitch, I'll make you a deal. After I'm dead, you talk. I'll listen. I laughed too. But 2 days later, Maury passed away. And in the weeks that followed, when I sat in my basement and tried to write this book to pay Maury's medical expenses, which was the only reason the book was ever written and where all the advance money went, I kept coming back to that same sentence on that last day and that last minute. You talk, I'll listen. And I realized that it wasn't an accident that Maury waited until the end to share that with me. Because in that sentence is everything he had ever tried to teach me and everything I am trying to get across to you here. And it's simply this. If you lead your life with people, giving to people, sharing with people, making memories with people, then when you die, you are not 100% gone. You will live on inside the heads and the hearts of everybody you touched. And they can talk to you, not because they believe in ghosts or seances or anything, but because you spent time putting your voice inside them so they can hear it. It rings around. It's like a penny in a piggy bank. When you take a penny and you put it inside a piggy bank, for all intents and purposes, it's gone, right? It's dead. It's gone. You can't see it anymore. You can't own it anymore. You can't hold it anymore. It's gone, right? But take the piggy bank, and there it is, inside. And as Maury said, death ends a life, but not a relationship. The relationship can go on. But, and here's the big but of this whole talk, but you must invest in those relationships while you're here if you want anything of you to go on after you're gone. So, if you spend all day working for the sake of working, as I have done many times in my life, too many days of my life, if you spend all day in front of the makeup mirror trying to get beautiful, or all day at the gym trying to get buff, if you spend all day trying to do amazing things that'll get you on the cover of some magazine, on some list or another, then when you die, you better plan on being 100% dead. Dead with a capital D. Because your money, no matter how much you accumulate, they're only going to fight over after you're gone. They always do. Your beautiful body, no matter how gorgeous or buff, is going to rot in the ground right next to the fat guy. Your list of accomplishments, no matter how impressive, will pale in comparison to the next hot shot who gets the next magazine cover. But that one thing that you had that makes you distinctly you, that separates you from everybody at your table and everybody in this room and everybody on this planet, that voice that's the sum of what you did and you learned and you loved and you experienced, you didn't spend any time giving away. You were too busy taking to feel alive. So if you want to cheat death, you want to put your chips on immortality a little bit, it is not in amassing the biggest stock portfolio. It is not in owning a network. It's in every small act of kindness, of generosity, of sharing, of making a memory, of helping people in areas where they need help, where they will remember the person who came to their aid, put a face and a name to the person who helped save their life in some way. That is how you live on. That is how you are remembered. One life touches another, and another, and another. And if you don't think that that's true, or you think that's just a corny way for your corny speaker to wrap up his corny talk, then look around. Why are you here? Why are you listening to me? You don't know me. You didn't know Maury. He wasn't rich. He wasn't famous. Didn't own a network. He was just a nice old guy, a nice old teacher who took time in his dying days to share his time with me, to help try to make me better. And I wrote a book in return to try to help him pay his medical expenses, a tiny little book. And somebody read it and passed it on to somebody and passed it on to somebody and passed it on to somebody. And now look how large his classroom has grown for a guy who's not even here to teach it. Maury never read a single word of Tuesdays with Maury. But you did. And you know him. Because he's alive in here and in here. That's how you go on. So for the kids, you're not kids, but students are always kids, who are studying, for the adults who are teaching, particularly for any teachers in this room who are the most underappreciated and underpaid segment of society. You will have moments in your future where you ask, public service, what am I doing? I could be making so much money. Brains like I got, I could be out there in the private sector making so much money. I could be doing this, I could be doing. What is it all about? When you ask that question, if I've learned anything from my old professor, there is only one real answer. You follow your heart. You follow your heart. I trust it will not lead you astray. It will lead you to others. Thank you very much for listening to me. I appreciate it.